Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 4. These are the tough issues that anyone doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 4, the top 3 issues are the text of verse 3, the form and meaning of the word nasa in verse 7, and the tense and mood of the verbs in verse 2. Are these verbs imperatives, asking God for help, or indicatives, thanking God for what he has done? The first of our top exegetical issues in Psalm 4 is the text of verse 3. In the NIV, verse 3 says, "How long will you people turn my glory into shame? How long will you love delusions and seek false gods?" But now look at the NJB translation. "Children of men, how long will you be heavy of heart? Why love what is vain and chase after illusions?" You'll notice several differences between these two translations, but the most important or fundamental difference is the difference between the NIV's "my glory into shame" and the NJB's "heavy of heart, why?" So according to the NIV, the psalmist, the speaker here, is accusing these people of dishonoring him, of turning his glory or honor into shame. There is some personal crisis in which the psalmist is suffering at the hands of some group of people that he here addresses. But according to the NJB, he accuses this group of people not of dishonoring him, but of being heavy-hearted, or that is stubborn, hard-hearted, just like Pharaoh in the Exodus story, who hardened his heart and stubbornly refused to let the people go. The difference between these two translations is a difference in the underlying Hebrew text. The NIV, "my glory into shame," is based on the Masoretic text, Kavodi lichlima. The NJB is based on the supposed Hebrew text underlying the Septuagint's translation, Kivde lev lama. The actual text of the Septuagint says, "You sons of men, how long will you be dull-witted? Why do you love vanity and seek after falsehood?" The Greek word translated dull-witted is literally heavy-hearted, barukardioi. And so it's generally agreed that instead of kavodi lichlima, as we have in the Masoretic text, the Septuagint translator had a Hebrew text that read kivde lev lama, heavy of heart, why? And this reading differs from the Masoretic reading in 4 ways. First, it has a different division of the words, lichlima versus lev lama. Second, it has a bait instead of a kaf, lich versus lev. These two letters look very similar and often get confused for one another. Third, it assumes a defective spelling for the word translated heavy, kivde, where there's a holem vav in the Masoretic text, kavodi, the Septuagint's Hebrew source text probably did not have any vav. Fourth, related to these other differences, the Septuagint's reading assumes a different vocalization, kivde lev lama, instead of kavodi lichlima. But even though there's a long list of differences, the similarity between the two readings is obvious. If you're looking at a manuscript with no vowel points and no spaces between words, or maybe just small spaces between the words, the two readings look very similar. It's easy to see how kavodi lichlima might have become kivde lev lama, or vice versa, how kivde lev lama might have become kavodi lichlima. Either reading could be the earlier reading, with the other reading arising as a copying error. Our goal here is to figure out which reading is earlier and which is the copying error, which is secondary. Let's start by evaluating the reading of the Masoretic text. Kavodi lichlima, my honor into shame. In addition to our medieval Masoretic manuscripts, this reading is supported by the Aramaic Targum, and to some extent by Jerome, Aquila, Symmachus, and the Peshitta, though some of these reflect a slightly different vocalization of the text. In any case, it's clear that the Masoretic reading is an early reading, going back at least to the 2nd century AD, the time of Aquila and Symmachus, and it was the dominant reading at this time, being reflected throughout all of these early translations and in all of our medieval Hebrew manuscripts. And this reading works well in the context. Some have argued that it seems a little strange syntactically, but in our view, the syntax is normal. Kavodi lichlima is a verbless clause, subject kavodi, my honor, the predicate complement lichlima, into shame, and the lamed preposition on lichlima conveys a sense of transformation. The psalmist's honor becomes shame. We find the same syntactic construction in Psalm 37:26, Zar'o livracha, which the ESV translates, his children become a blessing. So syntactically, the Masoretic text reading in Psalm 4:3 is perfectly viable. In terms of meaning, this reading makes sense, but it is somewhat of an odd parallel with the following line. The following line says, literally, love emptiness, seek falsehood. Now, some interpret this line to be about false accusations against the psalmist. The NLT, for example, says, "How long will you people ruin my reputation? How long will you make groundless accusations? How long will you continue your lies?" Now, if the NLT is right, and the second line in verse 3 refers to groundless accusations and lies, then the Masoretic text's reading in the first line, "My honor to shame," would be a great fit, better than heavy of heart. But it's also possible to interpret the second line in verse 3 as referring not to false accusations, but to the worship of false gods. The NIV, for example, says, "How long will you love delusions and seek false gods?" The word translated delusions is literally emptiness or worthlessness, and the word translated false gods is literally falsehood. And this is the kind of language that the Old Testament often uses to characterize other gods. To give just one example, Amos 2:4 says, "Their false gods, to which their fathers were loyal, led them astray." The word translated false gods, kezavim, is literally lies or falsehoods. It's the same word we have in Psalm 4:3. Also, the language of loving and seeking, which are the two verbs in Psalm 4:3, often have God or a god as their object. It's more natural to talk about someone loving and seeking a god than it is to talk about loving and seeking false accusations. And so it seems likely that the second half of verse 3 is a rebuke of people who worship worthless false gods. There's nothing about false accusations in this line. And if this is correct, and if verse 3b is about worshiping false gods, then the Masoretic reading for verse 3a makes for an odd parallel. The relationship between the psalmist's honor becoming shame and worshiping false gods is not immediately clear. If we were to follow the Masoretic reading, then the best way to make sense of it would be to assume that the Lord is the speaker here. The Lord is addressing human beings, B'nai Ish, and he's rebuking them for their idolatry. Human beings, how long will my honor become shame? How long will you worship worthless false gods? And then in verse 4, the psalmist would start speaking again, calling on these people to repent and worship the Lord. And so the reading Kavodi Lichlima can work in the context if we assume that the Lord is speaking in verse 3. The Septuagint's reading, "How long will you be stubborn or heavy-hearted?" also fits the context. First of all, it fits well as a parallel to verse 3b. Verse 3a accuses the addressee of being stubborn, and verse 3b accuses them of worshiping false and worthless gods. And so the verse as a whole is saying something like, how long will you stubborn people keep worshiping these worthless false gods? So the Septuagint's reading makes good sense in the context of verse 3. And when we broaden our view of the context to include the next verse, the Septuagint's reading becomes even more compelling. Verse 4 says, "But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself." This word translated set apart, the word hifla, only occurs a few other times in the Old Testament, and almost always in the plagues story of the book of Exodus. For example, Exodus 11:7 says, "But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." Note the similarities between this verse and Psalm 4:3. Both of them talk about people who are resisting God's will coming to know that God makes a distinction between those who are his people and those who are not. He sets apart his own people for special treatment. Now, what's interesting and relevant to the textual problem in Psalm 4 is that the phrase heavy-hearted or hard-hearted also only occurs in the Old Testament in connection with the Exodus plague story, where it refers to Pharaoh hardening his heart. So we can see both phrases side by side in Exodus 9:4. "But the Lord will make a distinction, v'hifla Adonai, between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all that belongs to the people of Israel shall die." And a few verses later, "And Pharaoh sent, and behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead, but the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. Vayichbad Lev Paro, and he did not let the people go." So if we were to adopt the Septuagint's reading in Psalm 4:3, we would have two rare expressions in this psalm, one in verse 3, one in verse 4, that are both uniquely associated with the Exodus plague story. Now, it would be a remarkable coincidence if this connection were the result of a scribal error. It seems more likely that this connection was intended by the author of the psalm, and that the Septuagint, our earliest witness to this psalm, has preserved the earlier reading in this case. It's also worth noting that the Septuagint's reading stubborn or heavy-hearted fits well with the question, how long, in verse 3a. The question itself implies that the activity for which the psalmist is rebuking these people has gone on for a long time, and this fits well with the idea of stubbornness or hard-heartedness. Actually, it's interesting to note that Moses and Aaron asked the hard-hearted Pharaoh a similar question. How long will you refuse to submit to me? Let my people go so they can worship me. And so in terms of meaning, the Septuagint's reading seems to be an excellent fit at multiple levels of the context. The immediate context of verse 3a and the question of how long, the context of verse 3 as a whole and the parallel with verse 3b, and then the slightly wider context of verses 3 through 4 with these two words both associated with the Exodus plague story. And as we've tried to show throughout the rest of our material for this psalm that you can see on our website, this reading makes good sense when you consider the psalm as a whole. The strongest objection to this view is that it's not syntactically viable. The words will you be are actually not in the text. It just says literally, mortal humans, how long heavy-hearted? We might have expected an explicit pronoun. How long will you, atim, be heavy-hearted? Or maybe we would have expected a to be verb. How long will you be, tihu, heavy-hearted? But the pronoun or the verb in this case is easily inferred from the context, specifically from the preceding vocative, mortal humans. Because the psalmist is addressing a group of people in the second person, a second-person pronoun or verb can be assumed. And there are some other examples in poetry of verbless clauses like this one, where the pronoun you is assumed and omitted. Psalm 91 begins with the speaker saying, to the Lord, you are my refuge and fortress, my God in whom I trust. The pronoun you is not explicit, but it's understood from the context. As, for example, the Septuagint makes clear in its translation, my supporter you are, and my refuge. Another example is Psalm 89:9, which the NIV translates, you, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. The Hebrew text lacks any word for you are, but it can be inferred from the context. Again, this is how the Septuagint understood this verse. You are powerful, O Lord. Also, there are other how long questions in the Old Testament that have even more elision or awkward syntax than what we have here in Psalm 4:3. So for example, Numbers 14:27 says literally, how long with this evil congregation? And the King James Version helpfully supplies the implied content. How long shall I bear with this evil congregation? The elision involved in the Kivdei Lev reading in Psalm 4 is minimal compared to passages like this one. In conclusion, we think that the Septuagint's reading is probably the earlier reading. How long will you be heavy-hearted? Why would you love what is worthless, seek what is false? Although both readings make sense, the Septuagint's reading fits the context better. The reading of the Masoretic text, Kavodi Lichlima, can be explained as the result of a scribal error, since the two phrases look very similar. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a C rating. The second issue in Psalm 4 is the form and meaning of the word nasa in verse 7. There are three main ways that this word has been interpreted. The ESV represents most modern translations whenever it renders nasa as lift up. Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. According to this interpretation, nasa, nun samek he, is just a weird way of spelling the common verb nasa, nun sin aleph, or sa. A second way of interpreting nasa is represented by the neb. The light of thy presence has fled from us, O Lord. According to this view, the word nasa should be vocalized as nasa and interpreted as a cowl third-person feminine singular katal verb from the root nous, to flee. A third way of interpreting nasa is to read it as an imperative related to the noun nes, which means banner or sign. Lift up the light of your face as a banner over us, Lord. Although this view isn't represented among the modern translations we consulted, it has some notable proponents, including the medieval Jewish commentator Rashi and the 2nd century Greek translator Symmachus, and a similar view is also reflected in the Septuagint. We'll evaluate each of these positions one at a time. First, let's look at the common interpretation, nasa as lift. Proponents of this view note that the verb lift, nasa, nun, sin, aleph, would be the obvious verb of choice here. This verse in Psalm 4 alludes to the Aaronic blessing in number 6, which says, "The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up, yisa, his countenance or face upon you and give you peace." And so in light of this allusion, it makes the most sense to interpret the verb nasa in Psalm 4 as a form of this verb lift that we find in the blessing in number 6. The problem with this view is that the form nasa, nun samek he, would be an unusual way to spell the word for lift in the Aaronic blessing. In fact, every letter is unusual. In the first place, the imperative form of nasa is usually sa, without the nun at the beginning. There's one example in Psalm 10:12 of the imperative nasa with the nun at the beginning, so it's not impossible by any means, but it remains unusual. This is a very common verb, and when it occurs as an imperative, as it often does, it's almost always sa. And then there's the problem with the second letter of the word. Nasa, in the sense of lift, has a sin for its second letter, but the letter here in Psalm 4 is samek. Now again, there are plenty of examples in the Old Testament of sin and samek interchanging for one another. Still, it would be an unusual spelling of nasa in the sense of lift. And then there's a problem with the third letter. Normally, the third letter in the word nasa, lift, is an aleph, but here we have a hey. Now again, these two letters, aleph and hey, often interchange for one another. But again, it's not the spelling we would expect if the word here was the normal word for lift. And so the traditional interpretation of nasa in Psalm 4 as lift assumes that every letter in the word reflects some relatively rare spelling phenomenon. Now, it's not impossible. None of these spelling differences on its own is that problematic. But when every letter has some weird spelling, it should at least cause us to question whether we have the right word. Maybe it's not a variant form of nasa, lift. Well, if it's not, then what else could it be? Some have argued that nasa here means has fled. The light of your face has fled over us, or fled from us. This interpretation has the advantage of being able to easily explain the consonantal text. There are no odd spelling problems like there were with the last interpretation. But there is a basic syntactic problem with this interpretation. The verb nasa is feminine, but the word for light, or the subject of the clause, is masculine. And so unless we appeal, as some do, to some archaic verb form that's otherwise not clearly attested in Hebrew, it's difficult to see how there could be a feminine verb here. And so neither this interpretation nor the traditional interpretation are very satisfactory. The first one has a serious spelling issue, and this one has a serious grammatical issue. So this brings us to our third interpretive option. Some have interpreted the verb nasa as being related to the noun banner, nes. Lift up the light of your face as a banner over us, Lord. There's a common Hebrew word, nes, that means banner or signal. To give just one example, Isaiah 11:10 says, "And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, who shall stand as a banner, a nes, to the people. For the Gentiles shall seek him, and his resting place shall be glorious." There's also some evidence for a verb related to this noun. Psalm 60 verse 6, according to the NLT, says, "But you have raised a banner, a nes, for those who fear you, a rallying point in the face of attack." The word translated rallying point is the verb hypnoses, which the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament explains as a verb that derives from the noun nes and means to assemble under the banner, or we might say to rally. So there's evidence for the existence of a verb related to the noun nes. The verb here in Psalm 60 is in the hitpolel stem, but it's plausible that the same verbal root would occur in other stems as well. The kal stem, for example, is sometimes used to form verbs derived from nouns. And so the noun chag means feast, and the related kal verb chagag means to celebrate a feast. The noun levena means brick, the kal verb lavan means to make bricks, the noun mashal means proverb or saying, and the kal verb mashal means to make up a mashal, to formulate a saying or a proverb, and so on. As Waltke and O'Connor explain, these kal denominative verbs designate some action implicit in the noun. If the noun nes, banner, had a denominative verb, we might expect it to be in the cal stem and to mean something like to make into a banner or to lift up as a banner. So it's at least plausible that this could be the meaning of the verb nasa in Psalm 4:7. Lift up the light of your face as a banner over us. Before we think about what this might mean in the context, let's take a closer look at the form. Can the form nasa in Psalm 4:7 be explained as a cal imperative related to the noun nes? Well, according to the hitpolel form lahitnoses in Psalm 60, the verbal root related to the noun nes is nasas. It's a geminate root, where the second and third consonants are the same. And this is what we would expect, since nouns that follow the pattern nes are usually related to geminate roots. So to give just one example, the noun chen, grace, is related to the geminate root chanan, be gracious. A cal imperative from the geminate root nasas would not be nasa, but nos. There wouldn't be a he on the end, unless we assume a paragogic he. Then it would be nosa. That could work with the consonantal text, so it would require a revocalization. Or it could be that the verb here is not nasas, a geminate root, but nasa, a three-he root. Geminate roots often have three-he biforms and vice versa. For example, the verb chanan we mentioned a moment ago also occurs as a three-he form in Psalm 77:10. The Hebrew Grammar GKC lists, just as a sample, 8 verbal roots that have both geminate forms and three-he forms. So it's plausible that the geminate root nasas, which shows up in Psalm 60, would show up here in Psalm 4 as a three-he root, nasa. And in this case, it would be vocalized as nase, the normal vowel pattern for three-he imperatives. Now, this analysis of the form is not totally satisfying either. It's plausible, but there's no clear evidence to support the existence of this verb. There's no other example of a cal denominative from the noun nes. And even the evidence of the hitpolel form in Psalm 60 is debatable. Some think it's related to a different root. Still, this interpretation of the form seems less problematic than the other two interpretations we've discussed. There are no glaring spelling issues or grammatical issues, but the best support for this interpretation is that the banner imagery, the nes imagery, makes really good sense in the context. According to the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, a banner, a nes, is used to identify a particular group and is often used figuratively to denote an example or something that shows the way. Oftentimes it's used in the sense of a rallying point, showing the way to a place of safety. The Isaiah passage we mentioned earlier is a nice illustration. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, who shall stand as a banner, a nes to the people. For the Gentiles shall seek him, and his resting place shall be glorious. In Psalm 4:7, the image of the light of the Lord's face, the Lord's blessing, being raised over his people as a banner, a rallying point, showing the way to true blessing, would fit well with what the rest of the psalm says. So remember, verse 4 says, "The Lord has set apart for special treatment one who is loyal to him." And recall how this verse probably alludes to the Exodus plague story when the Lord showed special treatment to Israel. His blessing was like a banner over them, identifying them, marking them out as distinct. And then the psalm invites others to rally to this banner. Verses 3 through 6 are addressed to people who worship other gods, and the psalm calls on them to repent, to see how the Lord has uniquely blessed his people, and to trust in the Lord instead of their idols. In other words, the psalm calls others to rally to the banner, to join God's people in living under the light of his face, under his blessing. And so the banner imagery, with its dual function of marking out a people as unique, identifying them, and calling others to rally, fits really well in the context of Psalm 4. It really epitomizes the meaning of the psalm. So according to this interpretation, verse 7 would be a description of the Lord's people celebrating his blessing over them. Many are celebrating the Lord's blessing and saying, "Who shows us good? The Lord does. Lift up the light of your face as a banner over us, Lord. Like a high banner, make your blessing on us be visible to everyone, marking the way to peace and security and rest." In conclusion, then, we interpret the form nasa, or nase, in verse 7 as a cal imperative related to the noun nes, meaning lift up as a banner. This interpretation better accounts for the form of the consonantal text than the traditional lift interpretation, and it also fits really well in the context. We give this interpretation a C rating. The third issue in Psalm 4 has to do with the verbs in verse 2. The ESV represents most modern translations when it says, "Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer." So according to the ESV, the verbs in the first and last lines of verse 2 are imperatives. Answer, be gracious and hear. And the verb in the middle line is a past tense indicative. You have given relief. Now, this is the most natural way to interpret these verbs as they appear in the Masoretic text. The verbs in the first and third lines are clearly vocalized as imperatives in the Masoretic text, aneni, honeni, ushama tefilati, and the verb in the second line is a katal verb, hirchavta, which in a context like this is usually past tense and indicative. Some have noted that the transition from imperative to indicative in the middle line, back to imperatives in the last line is a little jarring. Why would the psalmist say, "Answer me," and then say, "You have given me relief," implying that God has answered him, and then go back to asking God to be gracious to him and hear his prayer? Now, it could be that the psalmist is asking God for help, and then he pauses in the middle of his request to reflect on how God has helped him in the past. The GNT makes this clear when it says, "Answer me when I pray, O God my defender. When I was in trouble, you helped me. Be kind to me now and hear my prayer." That's one way to make sense of the text. Another way is to interpret the katal form in verse 2b as expressing a request, like an imperative. The NIV, along with a few other translations, say, "Answer me when I call to you, my righteous God. Give me relief from my distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer." And so according to the NIV, all of the verbs in verse 2, including the katal verb in verse 2b, have imperatival force. The katal in verse 2b would be an example of what some Hebrew grammarians call a precative katal. The problem with this interpretation is that the so-called precative katal probably doesn't exist. John Cook, in his book on the Hebrew verbal system, calls the notion of precative katal dubious. And as the Biblical Hebrew Reference Grammar notes, in most of these instances, that is, most of the alleged instances of the precative katal, it's also possible to postulate that one of the more typical senses of the katal perfect is involved. So it's unlikely that the katal verb in verse 2b is an imperative or a precative. It's probably just a normal katal describing a past act of deliverance. You gave me relief. This might result in a somewhat jarring transition from imperative to indicative to imperative, but it's the best way to account for the verb form. And yet there remains another problem with the ESV translation of verse 2 that we haven't mentioned yet. According to the ESV, which is just following the Masoretic vocalization, the verbs in the first and last lines of verse 2 are imperatives. Answer me, be gracious to me, hear my prayer. And these requests for God to graciously hear his prayer and answer him, they create an expectation that he's about to voice some prayer. Normally, when a psalm says something like, "Hear my prayer," the prayer itself follows. But in Psalm 4, there's no prayer that follows. The only option for a prayer is in verse 7. Many are saying, "Who shows us good? Lift up the light of your face as a banner over us, Lord." But in this verse, the psalmist is quoting the many. He's not expressing any prayer himself. Now, it's possible that the quotation only extends through the first line, "Who shows us good," end quote, and then the rest of the verse is the psalmist's own prayer. But the parallel between us in the A line and us in the B line, the only two instances of first-person plural language in the psalm, suggests that the speech of the many continues across both lines. And this is the normal pattern in the Psalter. Direct speech that begins in an A line usually, though not always, continues into the B line. And if we're right about verse 3, which says heavy-hearted instead of my honor into shame, then there's actually no hint of personal distress in this psalm. The people addressed in verse 3 are not personal enemies who are dishonoring the psalmist, but the mass of humanity who worship idols, humans as the psalm calls them. So there's no clear personal distress in the psalm, and there's no prayer following verse 2. Instead, there are clear references in the psalm to a present situation of peace. Verse 9 says, "In peace I will lie down and fall asleep." And in verse 8, as we understand it, the psalmist looks back on God's blessing in the recent harvest and says, "You have put joy in my heart since the time their grain and their new wine multiplied." And in verse 2, we've seen how he says, you granted me relief in the distress. And so with the sole exception of the imperatives in verse 2a and verse 2c, the psalm presupposes a situation of peace and well-being. There's no distress, and there's no prayer for help. What do we do then with the imperatives in verse 2? Answer me, be gracious to me, hear my prayer. Well, it's interesting to note that the Septuagint vocalizes the verb in verse 2a as an indicative, anani instead of aneni. The God of my righteousness listened to or answered me. In affliction you gave me room. Now this makes for a really nice parallel between the first two lines in the psalm. When I called out, Bakor-i, the God of my righteousness answered me. In the distress, Batsar, you gave me relief. But most importantly, this revocalization of the verb in verse 2a makes better sense in the context of the whole psalm. The psalmist is not asking God to answer him, he's thanking God for having answered him and having given him relief. Specifically, he's thanking God for answering his prayer for a bountiful harvest, which is what he mentions in verse 8. But what about the verbs in verse 2c? Admittedly, the Septuagint vocalizes the verbs in this line as imperatives, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. But it's possible to vocalize these verbs as indicatives. The consonantal text is ambiguous as to whether they're indicatives or imperatives. As indicatives, they would be vocalized as chanani v'shama. He was gracious to me and heard my prayer. And if we read the text like this, then everything clicks into place. It makes sense. The whole psalm is a celebration of God's blessing on his people, and an invitation for others to come and experience this blessing for themselves. And interestingly, this is exactly the message of Psalm 67, which has some striking similarities to Psalm 4. Both psalms allude to the Aaronic blessing and mention the light of God's face shining on his people. Both psalms are set in the context of a harvest celebration. Psalm 67:7 says, the earth has yielded its produce, which is a lot like how Psalm 4:8 says, their grain and their new wine multiplied. Both psalms also have a similar three-part structure. The first and last parts are about God's blessing on the people, and the middle part is a call for the nations to worship God and experience his blessing. And then, interestingly, the two psalms have similar superscriptions: for the director, with stringed instruments, a psalm. These parallels with Psalm 67, which emerge most clearly when we interpret the verbs in Psalm 4:2 as indicatives, confirm that we're on the right track. In terms of its genre, Psalm 4 is not a prayer for help amidst some distress, but a celebration of God's blessing and a call to the nations to come and join, to rally to the banner that has been lifted over God's people. We give our interpretation of the verbs in verse 2 a C rating. Even though we think that the indicative vocalization makes good sense in the context, we're sensitive to the fact that it isn't attested fully by any ancient vocalization tradition. The Septuagint supports it in part, but not completely. And so, while we do think this is the most likely interpretation, we keep our level of confidence at a C. Well, by now it's become clear that how we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. In verse 3, the psalmist rebukes people for being heavy-hearted or stubborn, for being like Pharaoh and hardening their hearts, refusing to acknowledge the supremacy of the one true God and instead clinging to worthless idols who cannot satisfy. And then he goes on to call them to repent and trust in the Lord, the one true God who can truly satisfy. Verse 7 describes the Lord's blessing on his people as a banner, marking his people out as unique and showing the way for others to come and find peace and security. And this interpretation of the psalm helps us to better understand the verbs in verse 2. This verse is not a plea for God to answer and hear, but a celebration of God's having answered. The whole psalm, in fact, is, like Psalm 67, a celebration of God's blessing on his people and an invitation for others to join. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 4, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at Scriptura.org to learn more.